In this video, we're going to be looking at how the government can intervene to try and solve some of these issues associated with common access resources. So the first type is government regulations. So we're talking about other things other than tax designed to try and reduce the overuse of common access resources. So the government can implement legislation that bans the use of certain common access resources. So for example, they might insist that alterations are made to certain production methods so it's emitting less carbon dioxide, which affects the air. Enforcing users to pay permits or license for certain activities. So that might include hunting, fishing, cutting down forests. That would all be examples of things you need licenses to do. Implementing changes to laws or having quotas on businesses for certain types of production. So an example, in Iceland, they have quotas on how many fish that they can catch because fish is such an important industry there. They want to maintain the common access resource for the future, so they have licenses and quotas on how much fish you can catch at any one point in time. So examples of government regulations, for example, common access resource may be something like ducks, so there may be restrictions on when people can go hunting. So you may only be able to hunt between certain months, like March and June, or you have limits on the amount of ducks they're allowed to kill a day, or certain ducks are not allowed to be killed as they are endangered. So they're all examples of how we can preserve a common access resource, in this case ducks or other animals that are hunted. Parkland can be excluded from excessive development. So Parks Victoria protects about 4 million hectares of land, and its aim is to make sure that land is used in a sustainable manner so it can help future generations and utilise the resources in the future. The government can also ban certain production techniques like commercial net fishing in Port Phillip Bay, would be an example of government regulation to preserve common access resources. Other examples, cars can be fitted with catalytic converters to reduce the amount of pollution and help improve the amount of clean air. So the idea is that to reduce the amount of pollution in the atmosphere. Banning substances. So since the 1980s, you can't use CFCs, which stands for chlorofluorocarbons, I think, as they create a hole in the ozone layer. So that infects like polystyrene type subjects, polystyrene type containers and things like that. McDonald's used to use them for their Big Macs because they cause a hole in the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is a common access resource because it protects us all from harmful UV rays. So the aim of these initiatives is to reduce current consumption of these common access resources and therefore boost intertemporal efficiency. Other regulations for fishermen, this is particularly in the industry for fish. So fish caught under a certain length must be thrown back into the ocean. You need a fishing license to fish in certain areas. You're not allowed to fish with nets in Port Phillip Bay. And a lot of countries you're not allowed to use cyanide or dynamite to catch fish to try and protect the resource as well. Another way that we can protect our common access resources is through indirect taxation. And a really good example to use, and one that I encourage you to use in your exams, is talking about climate change with clean air as the common access resource, and then explaining how the carbon tax can help protect that resource. So indirect taxation, the idea of indirect taxation just with negative externalities is to influence relative prices in the markets and alter the incentives for producers and consumers. So the idea is to promote behaviour that is more efficient, because certain types of pollution reduce the quality of clean common access resources like air and water. So the government introduces these taxes to try and reduce the use of common access resources. So climate change, for example, climate change is a common access resource. The common access resource in this case is the stable climate. So stable climate is the common access resource, and it's really important that we preserve this resource for future generations. So human actions, including the burning of fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide, is causing negative externalities in production and consumption, which is warming up the planet and reducing the quality of this common access resource. This warming could reduce the availability of future generations to enjoy favourable weather conditions, which we rely on for our standard of living. So it's important that you recognise that the common access resource is this stable climate. Potential costs of climate change, increased damage to homes, infrastructure and other common access resources, which may come from natural disasters. Typhoons, hurricanes and cyclones are predicted to be more extreme. There might be increased prevalence and intensity of droughts, reducing the productive capacity of the farming industry. So that idea of that drought will then reduce the fertility of the land, and reduces the amount of water available for farmers. And it can also lead to the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is a key common access resource in Australia as well. So if you're talking about climate change, you can talk about the stable climate and the Great Barrier Reef, both examples of common access resources. So one key form of government intervention was the carbon tax. The carbon tax was implemented in 2012 and unfortunately was removed in 2014. And the tax was initially set at $23 per tonne. And the idea is that it added to the costs of production for the top polluters in the world. So it had an indirect impact on other energy efficient businesses, but the main impact, because perhaps that affected their cost of production, but the main impact was on the top 500 polluters. The tax, even though it was levied on supply, was then increased cost of production for firms that use fossil fuels and then provided them with an incentive to use other methods of production. So households, for example, had an incentive to change their behaviour to avoid paying higher electricity costs. The carbon tax resulted in 17 million tonne reduction in carbon emissions, which helped to reduce the damage to the atmosphere and mitigate the impacts of climate change, which then helped to protect the common access resource. So the idea is that by limiting the effects of climate change and the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it helped to protect the common access resource, which is a stable climate. Benefits for efficiency: the tax internalised the negative externalities associated with burning fossil fuels and prevented an over-allocation of resources towards polluting industries. This helped to achieve a more socially optimal allocation of resources. The tax provided financial incentives for firms to look at changes to their production methods and encourage them to invest in alternative production techniques. Okay, these techniques included installing solar panels, which helps to increase productivity in the long term and also reduces costs in the long term, despite the high marginal costs in the short term. The tax reduced the level of pollution in the air, helped to protect the common access resource for future generations. This helped intertemporal efficiency because future generations would have a more stable climate and cleaner air, which are both examples of common access resources. Okay. Another thing we can do is subsidise certain industries. So the subsidies can encourage the development of clean technologies that do less harm to the environment. So, for example, at the moment, the government's got a renewable energy target scheme where they give subsidies to companies through sort of a reverse auction system, where whoever's willing to have the highest level of emission reductions at the lowest cost gets subsidised by the government in terms of if they want to invest in renewable technologies like wind, solar, or geothermal energy. Like indirect taxes, the subsidy influences relative prices, but in this case, it reduces the relative price of renewable energy and makes their cost of production lower. This encourages consumers to invest in renewable energy, and the government also assists innovation by implementing and reducing firms' implementation costs by implementing these subsidies. This will hopefully help to achieve intertemporal efficiency in the future. Unfortunately, there are challenges with common access resources. Often, these common access resources require international cooperation because, for example, something like a stable climate relies on cooperation from countries all around the world to have its desired effect on reducing emissions. So international cooperation is therefore necessary to lessen the impacts of climate change. So one example of cooperation was the Kyoto Protocol, so where countries came to an agreement about their level of carbon emissions. The idea was there would be a cap and trade system put in place where everyone would get a certain amount of permits to emit, and then those citizens that those businesses that don't need to use, or those countries that don't need all their permits can sell them to other countries and make money. With the idea that over time the government sells less and less permits, and therefore there's less, the price of permits goes up, and there's less and less carbon emissions in the economy. The European Union has their own cap and trade system in place at the moment, and permits can be traded in the market, so those who don't need them can sell them to those who really do. We'll talk about some challenge questions in the next video.